時間となりましたので、セミナーを開始いたします。本日座長を務めますのは、九州大学アジア・オセアニア研究教育機構研究推進ディレクターのスコット・バレンタイン教授です。バレンタイン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Great, thank you very much, Anai Sensei, and thank you, as always, to the QAOS team for putting together a wonderful series. It takes a lot of work. Those of you who are watching, it takes a lot of work to organize all of these, and it's very much appreciated, everybody's endeavors. Today, we've got a wonderful topic. We're going to be exploring Japanese history, and the one thing I really love about this topic is that we have a true specialist and someone who brings some very different insights and perspectives to the field of Japan's history. Today we're going to be joined by Professor Ellen Van Hooten, and Professor Van Hooten is an associate professor, of course, here at Kyushu University. She's been here for 10 years. Prior to that, she was at Hosei University, and prior to that, she was at the University of Ghent. What's interesting to me about this, and why I love that we've managed to get Professor Van Hooten to join us for today's talk, is because the whole process of being a historian is really about being a detective. You are trying to somehow use information from the past, which may or may not be reliable, in order to interpret what has happened, in order to shed some insights either into how we got to where we are now, or indeed how we might be able to get to a new destination in the future. And when you've got a foreign professors that are undertaking research in a field, they approach the study with a different set of lenses, a different set of personal experiences that add additional insight and nuance to the study of history. And this applies to any nation. Traditionally in Japan, with the exception of scholars such as Lafcadio Hearn, there hasn't been a lot of foreign historians that have made waves in Japanese history because it's so complicated. And even the act of going through very complicated texts in Japanese is enough to scare anyone off, and that has not scared off Prof. Van Hooten. She has done her dissertation focusing on a number of areas. Her dissertation focused on the analysis of Nagaoka, which was the old capital in Kyoto, and a link to her book is found in the chats. So if you're interested in following up on that. But today we're going to be talking about the Jidai Matsuri in Kyoto. And with that said, I'm very much looking forward to today's talk. Thank you, Van Hooten, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Give me a moment while I share my slides. Okay. Yeah. You see the slides? Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me today to participate in this Brown Bag lecture series, and of course for the very kind introduction, and the audience for making some of their valuable time available to attend today. The topic of my talk is Jidai Matsuri, or the Festival of the Ages, the well-known festival that, with a few exceptions, has been celebrated in Kyoto each October since 1895. In that year, the city celebrated its 1100th anniversary, and the festival was one of the many events organized for the occasion. In its current form, it comprises a procession of about 2,000 people who showcase the historical development of clothing styles and paraphernalia from the late 8th through the 19th centuries. In the years before COVID, this event typically attracted about 60,000 spectators from within and outside Japan. Today, I will discuss when and how the parade came about, because although Jidai Matsuri very quickly gained a reputation as one of Kyoto's 3 great festivals, next to much older traditions of Aoi Matsuri and Gion Matsuri. The emergence of Jidai Matsuri was by no means a given. As I will show, it was only after the unexpected postponement of another festival due to illness that someone came up with the idea of organizing this historical procession to commemorate the long history of Kyoto. It is, of course, very difficult to argue for causation, but it is quite possible that if this illness had not intervened, Jidai Matsuri would never have materialized. On top of that, there are some details in the narrative I will present today that may ring familiar to our ears in these COVID times. So let's travel back in time to Kyoto during the final quarter of the 19th century. The new Meiji emperor had recently moved his court to Tokyo, and as a result, the various palace buildings and aristocratic residences in Kyoto fell in disrepair. Moreover, Kyoto shops that had traditionally counted the imperial family and the numerous courtiers among their clientele lost a major source of income. To turn the downward trend, local businessmen and politicians came up with a variety of initiatives to reinvigorate the city and create an image of Kyoto as a center of modernization. Their activities paid off because by the mid-1890s, Kyoto would be home to both the first hydroelectric power facility and the first tram network in the country. Its status as a modern city was also confirmed when Kyoto was selected to host the 4th National Industrial Exhibition, a domestic version of the World Expos that showcased the country's modern technology, industrial developments, fine art, as well as regional products and resources. The first 3 such exhibitions had all been held in Tokyo's Ueno Park, but for the 4th edition, the central government also considered other locations, such as Osaka, Kobe, and of course, Kyoto. To strengthen its bid, Kyoto had tied its proposal to host the exhibition to the fact that in the year that this event was to be held, the city would also celebrate its 1100th anniversary. Kyoto was thus the only city where both the future and the past could be celebrated simultaneously. This was particularly appealing because in the contemporaneous international framework and in light of Japan's aspiration to be included in the select group of quote-unquote advanced nation states, the realization had grown that tradition was an essential ingredient of modernity. Kyoto, with its recent technological accomplishments and its history that extended back for more than a millennium, certainly could boast of being both a center of modernization and one of ancient culture and traditions. So starting in the spring of 1892, when Kyoto officially put forward its bid to act as host city, a slew of committees and subcommittees was set up to organize both the exhibition and the anniversary. This resulted in a very complicated patchwork of local and national organizations with different responsibilities and objectives. Membership sometimes overlapped, but this did not necessarily result in collaboration or even in a unified vision. The details needn't concern us too much, but it is important to distinguish between the 2 main committees. One was the Municipal Commemoration Committee, which consisted of 15 men elected from the Kyoto City Council and the citizens of Kyoto. The other was the Supporters Association for the 1100th anniversary of the capital to Heian. This latter organization was a nationwide network of supporters that counted members of the imperial family, high government officials, and important businessmen among its ranks. After some negotiation, the Okazaki area, east of Kyoto's Kamo River, which used to be an area of aristocratic villas, but now consisted mostly of cropland, was selected for the construction of the various pavilions for the industrial exhibition. The local authorities also decided that, as part of the commemorative celebrations, a replica at reduced size of some of the buildings of the ancient Heian Palace at the time of the city's establishment would be constructed. It is these replicas, originally meant as monuments attesting to Kyoto's long history, that in the final stages of their construction acquired another meaning as the result of the different objectives among committees that I mentioned earlier. When construction of the replica of the Heian Palace's audience was already underway, the Nationwide Supporters Association suggested to erect a Shinto shrine at its back, where the spirit of Emperor Kammu, the founder of Kyoto, would be enshrined as deity. After a lively debate, the local authorities concluded that they could not be involved. Kyoto's own city regulations prohibited direct participation in the erection of a shrine. However, the Supporters Association, the nationwide network, continued undeterred, and a compromise was found. Thanks to their successful fundraising campaign for the 1100th anniversary, a campaign that extended to all corners of the country, they were able to provide all the funds needed for the construction of the shrine buildings. In February 1894, the association applied for permission to establish a shrine, and in the summer, the central government acknowledged the importance of this shrine, bestowed on it the name Heian Jingu, and classified it as a so-called Kampei Taisha. This designation meant that the shrine was entitled to state offerings, and that, despite its very young age, it was among a select group of shrines that ranked second only to the Ise shrines. To cut a long introduction short, by 1895, Kyoto was ready to celebrate. Its citizens had seen the fields of Okazaki being slowly transformed into a modern exhibition venue with numerous Western-style pavilions. At the northern end of the plot, they had seen the whitewashed walls, vermilion red pillars, and green glazed roof tiles of the replicas of the ancient Heian Palace add extra color. And they had also seen Japanese-style shrine buildings rise up over the course of just a few months. Anticipation and preparation of the previous years would finally culminate in a series of festive events planned one after the other in the spring of 1895. Heian Jingu was inaugurated on March 15, the exhibition started on April 1, and the Great Commemorative Festival for the relocation of the capital to celebrate the city's anniversary was scheduled from April 30 until May 2. Not planned, but certainly contributing to the festive atmosphere, was the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki on April 17. After several months of fighting in the First Sino-Japanese War, the soldiers would finally come home. I would now like to focus attention on the 3-day commemorative festival to celebrate the founding of Kyoto. Details for this festival had been carefully worked out by the municipal authorities about a year earlier. One of the first priorities had been to decide on the festival dates to ensure that Emperor Meiji and his wife, the Empress Shoken, would be able to attend. The start date was also chosen to represent a meaningful link with Kyoto's history. April 30 in the modern Gregorian calendar was a conversion of the 12th day of the 3rd month of the year Enryaku 12 in the old lunisolar calendar. According to the historical records, this was the day on which Kammu Tenno had ordered the various government officials to provide laborers, and it is typically seen as the start of construction on the Heian capital. The actual festivities included 3 days of rituals and offerings to Kammu's spirit at Heian Jingu, banquets for honored guests, and entertainment for the general public. As much as possible, the events were to exude classical elegance and refinement, and be reminiscent of ancient court culture. The long list included traditional music and dance, such as kagura, saibara, and azuma asobi, dances from the recently acquired territories of Hokkaido and Okinawa, as well as demonstrations of archery, sword fighting, and naginata wielding. More modern events included military drills, brass band performances, and gymnastics demonstrations. Perhaps more important than what was included in this long list, however, is that which was entirely absent. At no point in time during the lengthy preparation process was there any hint at a historical parade, the likes of Jidai Matsuris. So what brought about the opportunity to organize a procession, and why is it held in October, when all celebrations related to both the exhibition and the anniversary were going to be held in early 1895. To answer these questions, we need to take a closer look at Kyoto in the days running up to the commemorative festival. As mentioned earlier, the city was ready for the celebrations. The 4th National Industrial Exhibition had been off to a very good start, and people were flocking to the city every day. Moreover, Japan had just defeated Qing Dynasty China, and according to successive articles in Hinode Shimbun, the local newspaper, Kyoto was now preparing for a triumphant entry into the city of a victorious Emperor Meiji to attend the festival planned for the end of the month. A triumphal arch had been built near Shichijo Station, and dignitaries had been assigned a spot on the platform where the train would arrive. The city was decorated with flags and flowers, and a layer of white sand covered the streets along which the emperor and empress would travel. Lanterns inscribed with "Hooray for the Empire" were hung from the eaves of houses and shops along the route from the station to the Imperial Palace. Elementary school children would line the streets, and any other citizen who wished to view the imperial couple's progress was instructed on how to properly do so. One could not look down from a height on the imperial carriage, nor could one lurk from the shadows. Smoking along the route of the approaching carriage was prohibited, and people should stand up and bow respectfully when it passed before them. Emperor Shoken arrived from Tokyo on the 26th and was welcomed first. The following day, on the 27th, Emperor Meiji traveled from the imperial headquarters in Hiroshima to Kyoto, stopping at a number of stations along the way to be greeted by crowds celebrating the war victory. He finally arrived in Kyoto around 7 p.m. that evening. For the most part of the 28th, the city was still oblivious to what only those closest to Emperor Meiji and those involved in the organization of the commemorative festival knew. The emperor had fallen ill and would not attend the festivities, nor would his wife. It is unclear which illness Emperor Meiji suffered. Some sources speak of a slight cold, but given that he would not leave the palace for about 2 weeks, it may have been something more serious. Regardless, it caused a flurry of meetings between members of the Supporters Association, the Kyoto governor, city official, and other festival organizers. And it soon became clear that the emperor's illness stopped the commemorative festival dead in its tracks. By the end of the day, an extra edition of Hinode Shimbun announced that all public celebrations would be postponed. The Kyoto City Council and the Supporters Association also printed a joint statement rescinding the invitation they had extended to various dignitaries to attend the banquets. For many of us, it is perhaps not too difficult to imagine the despondent atmosphere among those who had been looking forward to these events for months. Instead of the anticipated extravagant commemorative celebrations that were to last 3 days, only a brief ceremony attended by a select group of dignitaries was held at Heian Jingu on April 30. Of course, the festival organizers did not sit still very long, and almost immediately they started discussing the new dates for the grand festival. 2 suggestions were put forward. One was to start the celebrations on the 8th day of the 11th month in the old lunisolar calendar, because that was the name the day in 794 when Kammu Tenno had announced the name of his new capital, Heian. The other was to start the 3-day festivities on the 22nd day of the 10th lunar month. This was the date on which Kammu and his court had officially moved from the previous capital, Nagaoka, to Heian. Interestingly, the organizers suggested, in this case, not to convert these lunisolar dates into the modern Gregorian calendar as they had done for the April 30 celebration. They argued that if they were to convert them, the festival would be held around early December or mid-November, respectively, meaning the weather would not be as favorable anymore. So in the end, they would settle for the latter event, the day on which Kammu and his court had moved to the new capital in 794. However, even though October 22 is the day on which Jidai Matsuri is celebrated nowadays, That was not the day on which it was held in 1895. We must keep in mind that as far as the local authorities were concerned, this was merely a postponement of plans that had been carefully worked out months ago. The Municipal Commemoration Committee was fully aware that it might be difficult to find a date on which the emperor and his wife would be able to attend, and in fact, they would not attend, but to them, nothing needed to be changed to the program. They would again request the Imperial Household Ministry to send court musicians for the Gagaku performances at the shrine, and the banquets for the dignitaries and additional performances for the wider public would just be held on 3 successive days, starting on October 22, rather than on April 30. There was, in other words, no need to come up with new initiatives or ideas. And this is where the Nationwide Supporters Association once more enters the picture. On June 17, Nishimura Tsutezo, a top-level politician who had served in such positions as governor of Osaka and vice minister of the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce, made a well-prepared speech to a large gathering of association members. In this speech, he suggested the creation of a historical parade, the likes of which had never been seen before and would not be possible in Tokyo or Osaka, because neither of these cities had a history as long and illustrious as Kyoto's. He suggested a parade consisting of several segments, each devoted to a particular historical period. The level of detail of his proposal, combined with the fact that he even had worked out a plan to fund the creation of all the costumes and ensure that the parade could be held in perpetuity, make it clear that these were not mere off-the-cuff remarks. The powerful members of the association were immediately enthused, and within days, a committee of experts was created. They visited temples and shrines to study objects and garments and requested help from the Imperial Museum, now the Tokyo National Museum, and other collections in an attempt to make the parade as historically accurate as possible. As the summer progressed, so did the preparations for this new event suggested by the Supporters Association. But then another illness threw a wrench into plans made for the rest of the summer. Cholera, a highly infectious disease with correspondingly high mortality rates, had started to spread in Japan. Suffering one of its worst recorded outbreaks, Kyoto was hit particularly hard, and the number of infections was steadily increasing. On July 10, the Kyoto governor saw no other solution to stem the spread of the disease than to issue an ordinance prohibiting all shrine festivals. This prohibition took immediate effect, which meant that for the second time in just a few months, preparations for a major festival in Kyoto ground to a sudden halt. This time, the victim was, somewhat ironically, Gion Matsuri, which presumably has its roots in 9th century purification rituals intended to ward off pestilence. The festival that was supposed to start the next day was called off, and the famous floats that had been readied for the annual parade would have to stay put. The cholera epidemic did not subside, and later that summer, the bon dances were also prohibited. Theaters and other performance venues had initially been allowed to stay open, but in mid-August, they too were ordered to shut down. Their closure happened so suddenly that many patrons were caught unawares and suddenly found themselves in front of closed doors, leading to complaints about nighttime disturbances and street brawls. The theater owners themselves also protested loudly because they had already paid the entertainment tax, but were now suddenly left without income. Some complied and merely hoped they would be able to restart operations soon. But at least one famous theater, Shinkyo-goku's Ebisuza, one of only 2 main theaters in Kyoto with all female performers, found a loophole. Within days, the troupe had relocated to Otsu, just across the Higashiyama Mountains in neighboring Shiga Prefecture, where no restrictions were in place, and they started performing there. In the meantime, the municipal committee in charge of the postponed 3-day commemorative festival and the Supporters Association's committee in charge of planning the supplementary historical procession continued their respective preparations. The municipal committee held firm to the earlier program, and after some back and forth, the Supporters Association decided to schedule their Jidai Matsuri parade on October 25, immediately after the conclusion of the official festivities. Time was running out, however. It was now mid-September, and most of the costumes and paraphernalia required for the hundreds of people in the historical procession still needed to be made. Moreover, the governor had yet to lift his injunctions against festivals and performances. In another eerie similarity to the lifting of restrictions for certain occasions and events, the governor suddenly rescinded the prohibitions on September 22. He specifically mentioned that, and I quote, "The anniversary festival of the relocation of the capital, which has been enthusiastically planned by the citizens for many years, will be held only a month from now." At the same time, however, he urged the people to maintain the highest standards of hygiene and to be careful about the food and drink they consumed, because although the cholera epidemic had subsided somewhat, it was not quite under control yet. What is more, the text warned that cases of another infectious disease, dysentery, were on the rise as well. Restaurants and theaters could open their doors again, but had to comply with certain requirements. They should set up disinfection rooms within their premises, and they should limit the number of patrons to 2/3 or half of their capacity. In the end, it seems that cooler temperatures and people's adherence to health guidelines did bring the diseases under control. The official 3-day festival was held as scheduled, although perhaps with fewer spectators than anticipated, and one could in part blame the rain for that, because at least on the first day, several events were necessarily moved indoors because of the weather. And by the 25th, the sunny skies had returned. People showed up in droves to watch Jidai Matsuri's historical parade. The streets near the procession's departure point were packed from early in the morning, causing a delay of several hours. The huge turnout for the first Jidai Matsuri should not come as too much of a surprise. At the official festivities, the Kyoto citizens had been mere spectators, consumers of events organized for them. The Jidai Matsuri parade, on the other hand, had been the brainchild of a select group of powerful men, and although most of the initial funding had been provided by the Supporters Association, the procession's actual execution and continued financing had been placed in the hands of every single citizen of Kyoto. This was not just a parade for the people, but one with and by the people. Every citizen must have personally known at least a few men who walked in the procession. Moreover, every Kyoto household had contributed financially to its organization and would continue to do so for years to come. Finally, the protracted hot Kyoto summer, during which most social gatherings and forms of entertainment had been severely restricted or even prohibited, may also have contributed to the popularity of the festivities that fall. When the restrictions were finally lifted, people were ready to blow off steam and celebrate the founding of the city in earnest. Thank you for listening today, and let's hope that sometime soon, we too return to a life without disease-related restrictions.
Great, thank you, Professor Van Hooten. Can I just once again remind everybody, if you have any comments or questions, please pop them into the chat box. So 皆さんももし意見あるいは質問があれば、ぜひそのチャットボックスの方をご利用してください。While we're waiting, I mean, I can't help but be struck by some of the similarities between the planning for the Jidai Matsuri and of course the Olympics, which you alluded to in your write-up. Now, but in the case of the Olympics, one got the sense that there was a stronger impetus for economic reasons. To what degree do you think the desire to continue despite the barriers and get the Jidai Matsuri launched were driven by nation building aspirations or economic motives? What do you think were the underlying main drivers?
Oh, it's a it's a great question and a complicated question. Looking into the minutiae of how this parade came about, I'm less and less inclined to believe that there's one powerful, big nation-making organization behind these events. Because if you really look at the details, it's individuals who come up with ideas, who make suggestions, and then kind of steer the pathway, and eventually this does result in a parade that is extremely successful, although it was also severely criticized by the citizens of Kyoto, but they still saw it, okay, we have to continue this tradition and we have to improve, we have to make changes. So in that sense, like top-down nation building, no, it's more like a coagulation of ideas that brought about this event. What I do see is tension between the local level and this Kyosankai, so this supporters association, where in many instances it's going to be this nationwide network, which of course has all the strong businessmen and politicians, and also a very small number of imperial family members in there, who seem to always get the top hand. So there is a top level in there, but a lot of it is also individuals suggesting ideas and building up things. I didn't allude to it here, but as a local level development, the procession had been clearly planned out, and initial funding was provided by this leadership of the supporters association, and they had set guidelines of how many people could walk in each segment of the parade and whom they would represent. But there's one segment, and it's the segment that was organized by the Gion Quarter, so arguably some of the wealthiest citizens in Kyoto. And there's 4 men who decide, oh, we are also going to add ourselves. It's the parade with Oda Nobunaga, who was originally who was a famous warlord, for those who are not familiar with Oda Nobunaga. And he was going to be the only warrior in that segment, and accompanied by many lower level people. But there's 4 men in that city quarter who say, oh, but we also want to represent one of the famous warlords, and they paid out of pocket for their own horse, their own outfit, and all the kind of servants that walked with them. So there's definitely economics in play, wealthy people who could splurge.
There was a question in the chat that was, I think, building on what you've just been talking about, asking for a little bit more information on the Supporters Association. Yeah. I'd be interested, and I think maybe to extend the question in the chat, since you've answered a lot of it. How was there any information in your research on how the sharing of responsibility took place? Like, how did those that were financially in power involve those that weren't in power? Because of course, if you do that in the wrong way, you lose the financial motivations for wanting to do this from those that are in power. Did you come across anything along those lines in terms of how the dynamics worked?
Yeah, well, there's very detailed records. Most of these organizations, they kept track of who was a member. But first, to answer the initial question, so could you elaborate a bit more on the association? Who were they? Basically, it's the establishment is the result of Kyoto City itself, when they wanted to organize both the anniversary and the exhibition, traveling up to Tokyo and see how much support are we going to get for this combined bid. And then people in Tokyo kind of jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, this is a good idea. We are also going to set up our own organization. And it's especially this Kyosankai who kept very detailed records. There's a thick book with the list of names of every single individual in Japan who contributed to the financing. And that was kind of their strong point. They set up local committees in each of the prefectures, raising money, really fundraising. And in return, whoever paid money into the Kyosankai would receive a small medal, and then the medal would give them discount train tickets, which the Kyosankai, the supporters association, had also negotiated. So it's really this kind of big economic, let's negotiate with railroad companies, with steamships, everybody who pays into the funds gets a discount ticket to visit Kyoto and the Kansai area during the exhibition. So it's, yeah, there's very detailed, tedious records. In part, and the other aspect that you asked about was the sharing of responsibilities. Yeah. That's a little bit blurry because officially these national exhibitions, they are organized by the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce. So that's a national level ministry. And of course, it's then the city who builds all the pavilions. So there is a clear divide about who does what there. But because this Kyosankai, this supporters association, entered from the side, and that hadn't happened in Tokyo in previous instances, they kind of enter from the sides, but a lot of the people in the Kyosankai, in the supporters association, are high-level government officials. They do manage to steer through, yeah, back doors almost, the developments.
There's an interesting question in the box. Caleb Carter asks, in contrast with earlier Matsuri that often focused on religious, motivations or foundations, this parade seemed to be a break from the past, and presumably he's referring to the dominance of the emperor and the desire, I guess, to break up the or to solidify the nation after being split apart with the daimyos. How would you contextualize how novel this was in this time? Was this the first time this is happening, or?
Yeah, it's definitely a very new thing. Processions were becoming more popular, especially to commemorate certain foundings of cities. You do see a few of those in the Meiji period, but nothing comparable to Jidai Matsuri. But what's interesting here, even though there's this connection with Heian Jingu, so with the shrine, the first iteration of Jidai Matsuri, other than the shrine being just a stop on the way, there's no real connection with the shrine. And that was actually one of the points of criticisms after this first iteration. There's a few paper articles in which the authors complain that the parade was undignified, and they just grabbed a bunch of people. Of course, it was planned in a couple of weeks. They just grabbed a bunch of people who dressed up but didn't know how to behave themselves. And so the criticism was, why wasn't the shrine more involved? Next time we do this, we have to have the shrine and the shrine priests actually provide some of the people walking in the parade and guiding things along good lines. Also in the first Jidai Matsuri, Kammu Tenno, or the deified spirit of Emperor Kammu, is not present. It's only from the second time that he's going to be part of the parade. So in a sense, it doesn't really become a Matsuri closely associated with a specific shrine until 1896, from the second time onwards. So it's definitely an outlier.
Fascinating. Professor Yokota is asking, a bit in terms of personal background. What made you decide to explore Matsuri and the connection with illness? Was it just the fact that COVID came about and you started to look at that, or what?
It was completely coincidental. I'm working on a project that has more to do with the shrine than with the Matsuri. And at one point, so I was looking at the establishment of the shrine, so everything that happens in the spring of 1895. And what is not really mentioned in most sources is that these original festivities were going to be held April 30 until May 2nd. And so I started questioning, like, why doesn't anybody write to it? And why was this date shifted? And then I found, okay, Emperor Meiji becomes ill. So, okay, that's interesting, illness. And I kept digging into the process. And then you have the cholera epidemic come in and dysentery surface. So it wasn't really because of COVID that I started the project, but because of COVID, these links with illness kept popping up, and also the realization, I was reading through newspaper articles, and they indeed say, okay, restaurants just close, and you have to close tomorrow. You can't even notify people, or you have to, in box seating, instead of 6 people, you can only put 3 people. So, and all these eerie similarities kept popping up and made it a nicer detective story.
Right, right. A very interesting question from Jacob Ritari, who's he's asking, is there any record of international observers, you know, that were associated with this?
Yes. There were, of course, already foreigners in Japan at the time, and in the big book of the Supporters Association about donations, a number of non-Japanese names pop up. So they definitely donated to the campaign. Lafcadio Hearn actually writes about Jidai Matsuri. He visited Kyoto in the spring already to go see the exhibition. And then he comes back to come and see Jidai Matsuri again, because he purchased one of those amulets, or he donated to the Supporters Association and got one of those discount coupons amulets. I'm not sure how many foreign dignitaries were invited to attend the April and May festivities, but definitely in October, there were dignitaries from Russia, from the UK, and from France, if I'm not mistaken. So they definitely attended. Also, because this was the National Industrial Exhibition, Kyoto had produced English language guidebooks, because to these, even though this was a domestic expo, it was kind of customary that foreigners would also attend. And they were clearly targeting the foreign market as well by writing a history of Japan, a history of Kyoto, and then a guidebook to Kyoto and the surrounding provinces for the foreigners, fully in English.
Wow, fascinating. If I may, I'd just like to finish up with one, you know, sort of forward-thinking question. You know, because I love the reference to the plethora of committees and subcommittees that were involved in this. It reminds me of Kyudai, you know, and but you know, these things that can be so frustrating, you know, these endless committees and discussions. It strikes me that what they do in terms of a Japanese historical and cultural context is that they essentially ensure that tradition is preserved over time, because change is actually incremental rather than anything radical. But you know, as we now look at, you know, the 20th century, 21st century Japan, you know, we're starting to talk about the need for radical change, immigration that is going to, you know, address Cholera, but the reality is it's also going to significantly upset cultural traditions. Or, you know, another example is the need for innovation, you know, and to enhance Japanese, you know, economic output. These kind of things actually require something that goes beyond committees. As a historian who has studied this, how do you see that balance being managed moving forward? Are we going to see, you know, sort of a breakup of subcommittees, or are we going to, you know, see perhaps a a stickiness to path dependency in the future?
I don't. I really, I think to some extent, I wonder how unique it is to have committees and subcommittees and kind of, yeah, people working towards the same goal, but not quite. So I'm not entirely sure Japan would be unique. Thinking of my own home country, we kind of, I think heavy admin is kind of prevalent everywhere. In terms of radical change, yes, but again, I've started to wonder about all this top-down importance.
Yeah.
Because I keep seeing these personal initiatives, personal ideas that then somebody picks up and everybody runs with it. So maybe change needs to come from the bottom.
Fascinating chat today. Thank you so much for sharing, this historical perspective of the Jidai Matsuri. It was just wonderful. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Professor Ellen Van Hooten for just a wonderful, thought-provoking journey into the past. Please stay tuned, everyone, for a survey regarding what you would like to see in the future, and also for a PR spot on what's coming up next week. Prof. Ellen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk today.
Thanks, folks. Back to you, Anai Sensei.
フーテム先生、バレンタイン先生、ありがとうございました。最後に事務局より2点ご案内させていただきます。まず、次回のブラウンバックセミナーのご案内です。次回は来週7月13日水曜日の12時10分より、九州大学芸術工学研究院未来共生デザイン部門准教授の中村美也先生より、支援する・されるからの脱却、障害認知症ケアの場における競争的アート活動の可能性と題し講演を実施いたします。詳細はホームページをご覧ください。